In case you missed it, check out the previous webinar that I did with Holly. We talked about basically overcoming some of those invisible roadblocks holding back automation at scale. But today, I just want to welcome you again. So my name's William, Director of Technical Evangelism at Itential. And with me again is Holly Holcomb, Program Director for Strategic Accounts. How are you doing, Holly?
Not too shabby. Excited to talk about config consistency today.
Yeah. So it was one of the things we kind of glided over it in the last webinar, just a little bit of a touch along with some other things. But now we want to dig in a little bit further.
Yeah, I know that when we talk to our customers, we talk about this topic a lot. So William, I'm really curious to hear your side. What do you think of when you hear people talk about config consistency or config compliance? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, great and very important question, really defining it at its core. So to me, configuration consistency is really all about a predictable network. And predictability is, everything in our world at this point. You want your networks to be deterministic and you want to be able to predict their behavior. So I think about it like this. Config drift is like one of those big invisible blockers we talked about last time, and it kind of creeps in a little bit quietly, right? So if you think of in network engineering, changes can often get applied very urgently. You have an outage, you go in, you make a change to some network device or multiple devices during an outage. And then, because that service has to be restored ASAP. You can't take your time and do this, that, and the other. You all get on a big call and someone makes a change to fix it. And, these ad hoc, or I call them emergency changes, I guess, they can lead to configuration inconsistencies, obviously, or config drift. So, this, where I would say device settings, they're going to diverge from the intended baseline or standardized policies that you may have defined. And it's cause and effect here. So undocumented changes or these manual overrides that you have to make under pressure, or these fixes, they don't get propagated into the bigger picture of your architecture, or they don't get rolled back. So then you have this, situation where, you can introduce vulnerabilities, you have performance issues or, future outages if not addressed. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician is kind of reading from a different set of sheet music. And here's the kicker. It's incredibly hard to scale when every device is kind of doing its own thing. You end up spending more time, managing these exceptions than actually moving your business forward. But, that's just my take on it. And my take is, from when I worked on the customer side. But you have this unique opportunity to talk to a lot of big, companies out there and kind of see probably different themes across those companies. So what's your take, Holly?
I think that it is very much what you've just mentioned. And I think in addition to that, it's a lot of diversity in terms of tooling and vendors out there that they have to manage. So they've got a lot of complexity. The configuration standards vary across vendors. They vary across functional role of a device or infrastructure as a whole. And I think a lot of what we're hearing from our customers is that there's a certain degree of sprawl when it comes to the number of tools that they have to use in order to manage configuration consistency across their infrastructure. So I think I read a recent survey that said 70% of enterprises have at least 3 separate tools to manage device configuration. I mean, that feels like an understatement from what I see with customers on a regular basis, because they've got a tool that's specific to cloud. They've got a tool that's specific to their controller for SD-WAN. They've got another tool out there that helps manage their VM infrastructure, their Linux and Windows boxes. So I think that from our perspective, what we're seeing with our customers is very much that config consistency If it was only isolated to a single device type and a single role in the network, would be one task. And then when you take a bird's eye view at the diversity in the network today and infrastructure today, it becomes even harder. So I think we see a lot of our customers that are struggling with this issue. So we've talked a little bit about what config consistency is and the challenges that our customers are facing in terms of trying to manage it across all of their infrastructure. William, from your perspective, I know you just mentioned it a moment ago in terms of resiliency, but what is it that customers are really trying to achieve? Config consistency isn't the goal. What are they trying to achieve?
It's a really simple and really complicated question all at the same time. If I go on a rant here, throw something at me, make me stop talking because I'm kind of passionate about this area. But I think more than anything, we want our networks to be reliable. We want them to be secure. We want them to be efficient and optimized and also adaptable. So when it comes to maintaining correct state across a large distributed system like a network, we find that configuration consistency and compliance are like very tightly coupled. So, oh boy. So take the restaurant industry, for example. I'm not sure why I keep bringing up restaurants in these webinars. Maybe it's because I'm like always hungry. I don't know. But it's actually, I think, fits quite nicely. So in a restaurant chain, let's just call it, Holly's Taco Empire. Every location will probably have to follow some identical procedures. So think of these like golden configs. And this is to essentially comply with health codes from like bodies like the FDA and like local health departments. Maybe one of these procedures is maintaining refrigerators at precise temperatures to prevent like bacterial growth. I mean, I don't know if that's a real thing. Well, it must be a real thing. You don't want bacteria on your, stuff. But, let's say a few different restaurants were really, really busy. Holly's really, really busy. Everybody's busy. And maybe like 5 out of those 100 restaurants forgot to do those temperature checks in favor of getting through like a dinner rush much quicker. Well, let's say those restaurants had, I don't know, I'm out of my territory here, E. coli outbreaks or something, and lots of customers got sick. And then the investigation traced it back to like store level failures where you had improper food holding temperatures that allowed bacteria to thrive. So it is things like this that directly erode compliance. And then you're looking at like regulatory violations and penalties that directly impact the business as a whole, financially, which isn't good. And then, reputational damage and so on. So to me, this is pretty comparable to what really you want out of your network and your network management. So if you take a reactive approach to config consistency, then that means you're really taking a risk of being, if you're not proactive, you're going to be reactive with compliance. So, these misconfigurations could expose networks to threats and also directly impact your network's availability, both to your, employees and the customers you serve. Sorry if that was a little long-winded, but that's, I guess, how I see it.
No, I totally agree. There's 2 different aspects of the compliance that the food industry has to deal with. One is like, you should do good. So if you don't do good, then we're going to publicly shame you by putting your score out for everybody to see it, right? But then there's like the secondary piece of like, people could get hurt because you're feeding them food, right? The network could go down because you're not compliant. So like, I think it's like there's like the risk averse piece of compliance and the public like defamation aspect of it. But there's also the service impact side of it. That's, how much money are you going to lose because an application went down that's either internal or external facing? I think when we talk to our customers about the value that config consistency brings. It's the point of compliance for a lot of them, especially those who are having to deal with PCI DSS compliance, just as an example out there. There's also, I think you touched on it earlier when you were using your orchestra example. The expectation that I have if I'm playing with you in a band is that you're going to read the sheet music and you're going to interpret the music as it's written on the sheet. If both of us are interpreting things in our own way, it's very hard to scale and to build an orchestra, a whole band around it. So agility is also a piece that I feel like we see with a lot of our customers, and like the assumptions that you have on what exists on the network to make sure that your deployments are successful. So I totally agree. I think that there's a lot to be said for resiliency of your network, security of your network, compliance status of your network, and then agility and being able to build on top of it.
Yeah, and they're all interwoven, so you have to really get the foundations right, or else, hey, if everybody's playing different sheet music at the same time, it's still music. It's still music, but it's not the type of music that you want to listen to. And, that's the same for network. You're going to get a bad reputation wherever you work if your network's always going down. It's always BGP, it's always DNS, it's always this and it's that. And this Snowflake configuration over here, which broke, X, Y, and Z. And then everybody has a bad experience because everybody, uses the network directly or indirectly. Everything goes on the network.
When we talk about defining a standard that you're actually going to manage and audit across the network, that's usually, it's usually an effort that a lot of people take part in one way or another. What's your background? Do you see yourself as having more of a deployment mindset when you're defining what's going to be deployed on the network, more of a greenfield kind of perspective? Or do you see most of your bread and butter background in more of the day two ops side of things?
That's a good question. And those were two very different jobs for me. So I did both of them for quite a while. Earlier on in my career, I focused more on ops. And then as the more I learned and the more I've got, my hand in many cookie jars, I got into the engineering and the architecture side. And these are just two very different areas. And I truly believe that the ability for your ops team to actually operate, troubleshoot, and maintain the health of the network is dependent on engineering and architecture doing the best job to put together the best design, knowing what, how big is your ops team? What tools do they have to manage the network? What products you choose based on how you can support the network that you're building. So these are, in my experience anyway, these were two very different jobs. And earlier on in my career, some of the behavior that I would see sometimes was, and kind of going back to why DevOps was invented. Hey, you can't just put together this design and throw it over the fence at us and, cross your fingers and say goodbye. That's sort of changed for the better. And that was something that was really important to me, especially when I got into the engineering side, was saying, okay, we're building this new network and we really want to have a solid operational handover to that network operations center or whoever it was that was actually going to be operating things so that they can support it. And not only does that, if you do this the right way, you're doing your job the best that you can, but you're also not going to be woken up as much at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. and have all that type of stuff happen, which I've been there too. And that's no fun. Throws the whole week into chaos.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So I kind of in a sense, it's the engineers and architects are almost driving greenfield deployments. And then your ops teams obviously are going to be inundated with all the various brownfields that you might have in circulation.
That's a really great way to put it. I know that in a lot of the conversations we have, we are usually talking to either those who are managing greenfield deployments or those who are managing day two operations. And in some rare situations, we have them both in the room. But do you feel like it gave you a lot of empathy having done the operations role to kind of fine tune the way that you consider deployment for greenfield?
Yes, 100%. Because if you don't feel the pain, you don't think about these things of, okay, somebody else, like, okay, if I'm putting together a network, do I want to go back to my CCIE handbook and really like over engineer this network to, to space? Or do I want to build something that meets requirements that we can actually support? Those are two different, it's a fork in the road. So you can choose either way. You control your own destiny.
It's almost like defining those standards when you do your deployment it's a technical question or discussion, but it's also cultural as well. Understanding your organization and the people well enough to define what the right fit is going to be.
That's a really good point. So thinking of it in terms of, just thinking of it in terms, like, let's say greenfield deployments, it's relatively, well, I don't want to say it's easy, but everything's new. You can use whatever the newly defined standards are and whatever tooling you have in place at that time. And guess what? You're probably not going to break anything because production traffic isn't rolling over that network yet. So you can't, it is what it is, but you can't just forget about brownfield, right? Like, you can't just say, that stuff's over there, we're just going to leave it. And, those ops teams, they'll figure it out. Brownfield's a completely different beast. You've got years and years and years of legacy configurations with, institutional knowledge just sprinkled ever so slightly everywhere. And, today's networks, I don't think I've ever worked on a network that didn't span multi-vendor hardware in the last 10 years, very hybrid setups. And legacy systems accumulated through organic growth. You grow and the business grows and you have more stuff. And then there's M&A too. So I worked for a lot of companies that were M&A heavy. And that was always, that was like, for some companies, it was such a big thing with so much work that we had different teams that handled M&A only, basically. And this in turn, like, if you're zooming out to try and see the forest from the trees and you have all those moving pieces and you don't take that, the standard stuff very seriously, it's going to lead to snowflake devices with unique configurations that are very good at resisting uniformity. And one thing too that I've seen repeated like over and over and over and over again is, before we automate anything or before we want to get into this standard stuff, let's figure out every outcome that could possibly happen between now and where we want to get to. Let's do it all at once.
Yeah.
Let's clean up all our data before we ever get started. And by all, I mean all the brown fields, all the new green fields that we're using to even fund the automation program in the first place. So how do you create a standard out of that? I'm legitimately curious. It's a very challenging thing. Some might refer to this approach as boiling the ocean. And what's easier than boiling the ocean is boiling water in your cooking pot or tea kettle. Start small.
That's right. Oh, that's such a good point. You posted something on social media recently that was very much, I feel like, in line with what we see with our customers. It's almost always a topic that people want to tackle when they first begin their orchestration journey. They know that config consistency has so many great outcomes, like we just discussed a little while ago. And then when we check back in with them a few years down the line to see how that effort is going, how that body of work is going, it seems like many of them stall at defining the standard because they're trying to build every edge case into the standard. Instead of taking away chunks of the config that you want to say these are, consistent across a large swath of our infrastructure, trying to solve for all of the edge cases and solve for any challenges that you might find in a really diverse and complex infrastructure. Trying to solve for all of those before you even make any progress, I think, is something that we see with almost every customer we talk to. Defining a standard can be really challenging because you want to solve all of the problems before you actually start building something that's going to generate value.
Yeah. You've got to reconcile, so you have, when you embark on these big programs, like to the business, you have to show some sort of value, like short-term value. You have to show that you're doing something. Like if you're sitting on your thumbs for a whole year and you've got funding to buy tools and to maybe get some professional services or however it is that you're going to go about, trying to solve the problem for that business, and you don't show anything and you're just in planning analysis paralysis for all of time, that's not good for the business. It's not good for you or your team. You've got to show that you're doing something, but you don't want to also sacrifice like long-term value as well. You don't want to take shortcuts.
Right.
I would say that like if you really want to take all of this stuff like very seriously, that there's no huge shortcuts. For some of these things, you have to put in some of the time, and you have to, you don't want to cut too many corners, I would say.
I think another thing that we see is that I love the part that you just mentioned about no shortcuts. In some cases, going into a brownfield network and trying to build the bridge with the ops team that's going to help enforce that standard that you build, usually from what I've seen at least, there's a team that owns tooling around managing config consistency throughout the infrastructure at large. And then there's a team that has kind of the day-to-day operational responsibility of managing, updating config on the infrastructure, things like that. And because the team with the tooling is oftentimes the one that defines some of the deployment architecture as well, for them, this is a simple problem to solve. We'll just get the standard, and then we'll create an auditing mechanism that goes out and helps us figure out how far away from our goal are we. And when you talk to the ops team, who see all of the nuance across your infrastructure, they see all of the different ways that maybe it doesn't align with the standard, but it's there for a reason because this person made this change in order to make sure that this outage stopped, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a year ago. I think that one thing that we've noticed is that defining a standard, kind of like what we talked about earlier culturally, is also about building a bridge between teams so that you're all on the same page with what the standard should be. And being able to have that feedback loop of if this thing is consistently out of line in terms of our standard, how do we start moving towards a place of baking it into the standard? How do we start formalizing that into something that we can then manage instead of consistently excluding it from our audits or consistently saying it's something that needs to be it needs to be there, but it needs to be flagged every month or so when we do our checks.
I love that. I was actually just talking to a customer not too long ago that's exactly their frame of thinking when they were building some different things. One example they gave that was, I thought, rather valuable is they do a lot of like firewall rule changes in a lot of different areas, on-prem, cloud, everywhere. And for some of their firewalls, kind of, I think it was in colos, as these rules get added and added and added, they weren't getting removed. And so they basically set up this process and, they put this into the standard to say, okay, when you submit this form, it adds the firewall rule. We have all the data and the metadata surrounding that firewall rule. If that firewall rule doesn't get any hits, no matter what, they had a time frame, a threshold, it automatically gets pulled back out. Because what they were finding is they had all these rules being added and added and added over time. And then they had just, firewall rules sprawl everywhere. And how do you audit that? It's very hard to audit that. And moreover, if something isn't being used for X amount of months, then why is it there?
Mm-hmm.
So they had this auto remediation process, which I thought was really cool. And, one of the questions I'd asked them is, have you ever caused an outage by removing rules? Or maybe it started taking traffic the day after you decided to remove the rule or something. And I'm like, no, we never had that happen. So I thought, if as long as you understand the threshold, you understand the rules and the constraints and the process, and it's in the standard, that's very smart, very tactical, and I loved it.
So, William, with all of the diversity in the network and all of the different ways that you could come and tackle this problem, Like how do you make progress? Like, how do you make the right decisions on what to do first? How do you not boil the ocean?
So one could come into a network device and say, hey, I want to model the whole config and get all my data in a row before I do anything. And if you do that across everything, then, maybe you just won't get anything done. But if you take like small snippets that are like very important, like one example, say that you have a routine change where you have to go and rotate S&MP strings across your environment. Maybe it's some sort of security compliance, just something you have to do. Like every, this many months we rotate S&MP strings. Well, start there. If that's one of those changes that you're doing very frequently, which is also very important, it's a change you don't want to mess up because, hey, if S&MP gets messed up on the device, guess what? If you're plugged into SolarWinds or Graylog or whatever it is that's monitoring the device, you're going to have a problem if it's using S&MP strings. You're not going to have visibility. You're not going to have eyes on that device. So that's a problem from operations because they're not going to see, okay, neighbor changes or, something goes down or, the data that's coming in via S&MP to that monitoring tool. You're not going to have it. So keeping that consistent and that's not something that's super hard to template out and, make changes. So I think it's a good starting point. Like taking little snippets like that is something that's actually real and it's a problem that you're trying to solve. And it's something you do pretty routinely. Whereas, you could go after the parts in the config that don't change a ton or that aren't a big problem, and you're not going to be able to show as much value as I think the S&MP example is probably a really good one.
Mm-hmm. I think what we've been seeing with customers is that it's really tempting to want to do the big project first because it's going to give you a ton of ROI. But it's so important to sprinkle in some quick wins and small iterations so that it doesn't take 8 months to a year just to see some ROI on all the effort that you've put into the config consistency goal. So I think you're totally right. Small config snippets, identify the things that are going to make the biggest impact that don't require months of investigation in order to figure out like how to implement it in the correct way. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. And yeah, I love this. It's like pick your battles, start with those config elements that cause you the most pain and, or maybe they represent the biggest amount of risk for whatever reason. Really important. And then second, make it easy for teams to stay consistent by giving them the right tools and the right guardrails and the wherewithal to actually do this. You make it easy to do the right thing. And I think as we sort of go and we close this up, do you have any, given your experience and exposure to seeing a lot of these firsthand, do you have any tips for the folks out there that can, what can they think about as they try to kickstart their config consistency journey? Right? Where should they start, Holly?
Absolutely. Well, I'll put in a quick plug. We've got a white paper on our website that is all around a methodology for achieving config consistency. And it talks about some of the things we've mentioned in this webinar. It's talked about focusing on config snippets. And it also talks a little bit about how you overcome the problems of defining a standard. There's some really interesting content in there about AI as well. So I definitely would say a good first step just to understand resources that are out there would be to check out that white paper. And then, like you mentioned before, isolate out the things that are going to give you immediate value that don't involve boiling the ocean, and sprinkle in those quick wins with the strategic ones that will take a little bit more time and finesse in order to get to the goal. So I think that those are two things to keep in mind when it comes to where to get started with config consistency.
I love that. We'll link that methodology guide from our website. And, remember, a predictable network is a stable, secure one. That's the foundation for automation that actually works. So thanks everyone for tuning in. If you want to discuss this further, feel free to reach out to Holly or myself on LinkedIn. Or if you want to learn more about iTential just in general and the technology that we've built to tackle this problem, among others, at enterprise scale, make sure to visit itential.com and check it out. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.